What is up, everybody? My name is Richard Terrell. I go by Kirby Kid, and you are watching DL Live, a daily, semi-daily, sometimes daily stream show in which we talk about game design. And the last topic I talked about, it was ice cream. It wasn't ice cream, it was abstraction, copycats, lookalikes, knockoffs, things of that nature. Like what do we do and how do we think about games that appear to be trying to recreate another game almost exactly, but without infringing on copyrights? What do we do when two games are really similar, or one seems to be trying to knock off the other? What does it mean to be a knockoff, and why do a lot of knockoffs seem to share the same core problem, the same core complexity and quality problem? This stream is going to be an extension of those topics, and as I tweeted, which I will read, this is a continuation. We're going to talk about art, abstraction, complexity, solidity, which is like a random thing that I made up, and what I mean by these things. So I think when I think about the kinds of games that I want to make in the future or whatever, the kinds of interactions that I want to be at the core of my game, or even the kind of stories or the kind of graphics or whatever, I tend to draw from a really detailed and long-running source of inspiration. I was fortunate enough to get a really good education. Even my middle school and stuff took us to a bunch of museums in the Dallas area. And then high school, more museums and unique places to go and visit. And then in college, we had crazy libraries, and I got to look at like ancient, not ancient texts, but really old printings of books where they used to write on animal prints and animal skins, and you had to wear gloves to look at these books in these very special places, and that was kind of neat. Had classes in a museum and basically built the entire curriculum out of what you could find at that museum and what was currently being curated. So I draw a lot of my inspiration from life, and the museums are just cool because they house a lot of that diversity and unique things all in one place. But even beyond those walls, unique hobbies, unique experiences. I've got to travel a little bit, all still mostly within the United States, but I've been to East Coast, West Coast, North, South, and to Canada. And what's neat about some of those trips were like orchestra trips where we get to kind of have fun with our friends and go snowboarding in Colorado, and others were like tagging along with one of my friends' sort of family reunions, and they were up in the mountains of North Carolina and kind of really got to see sort of a different world up there and a different way of living, and how everyone's like so spaced out, and it took nearly 30 minutes to go from the base of the mountain up to where the cottage was on the top driving. So that's kind of crazy. Lots of little things, being out in the middle of nature, and being out in the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico, because I grew up in Corpus Christi, and touching animals at the aquarium and seeing animals brought to us at these cool petting zoos and stuff like that, and riding an elephant, things like that. So inspiration, life, I say all this to say that life is complex and it has a lot going on, and the particular things that you think and feel are all reflective of your personal life and experiences, and that's a lot to draw on. That's why art is so interesting, because the complexity of the world and the complexity of people are funneled and focused and narrowed down through the medium to try to convey some of what's really special and interesting about these things. So, you said it before, I've explained it a bunch of different ways, but there are diminishing returns if you take your inspiration from art itself, especially if you try to do more like that thing in the same medium. I mean, just like a genetic pool and the genetic diversity, you have to pull from other places in order to keep yourself healthy and alive and sustainable. Being inspired by video games to make video games is just so ineffective. And the interesting part to consider why it's ineffective, I think it has to do with the nature of complexity itself. And Like when you experience something, you don't experience all of its complexity, really. That's why you can read books and replay games and discover new things and continue to enrich your understanding of the thing itself. So no matter how big of a fan you are of something, you probably haven't looked at it enough as a designer or developer to sort of do what they did, but better. Chances are, if you really like something, you really like it because it's good, and your attempt to try to do something like it's probably going to fall far short. There are very few cases where like this game's a terrible mess, but it had this one little thing, and I'm going to try to, even in that case, like trying to do that one thing and make it better is taking a piece of a game and then being inspired and building more around it. When we're talking about knockoffs, when we're talking about copycats, we're really talking about people that try to copy more than just a piece, and not just like more than just a piece, copying more than just a piece from a single source, and that source being a piece of art in the first place instead of the life and its complexity. So one thing that I thought was interesting is complexity sort of can't be compressed. I say that all the time. I used to say it on my blog. And there's really no way to convey information. Like there's no way to sort of convey more out of like a single letter in the alphabet than that letter can represent. And you can't like shove a whole book worth of information or a whole story into a single letter. It can only communicate that much. And we put these things together. We put letters together, make words, and words together, make sentences and sentences to paragraphs and paragraphs to stories to chapters to whatever, and then we build from there. And every piece of thing that you add to it is adding to the complexity with the purpose of hopefully creating something meaningful and valuable. That's a With that said, there's something kind of interesting that we can reflect upon when thinking about how we interact with complex things. Like everybody probably should have a memory of themselves. They thought, X hobby was easy or simple or one way, and then when they finally do it and practice it and get better at it, they have a whole different view of it, right? I thought people just, memorize their lines for their play easily because they, perform so well when it's showtime. You're like, well, people struggle to memorize things, and they have all kinds of routines and techniques and disciplined practices in order to make sure that they learn their lines. And sometimes looking from the outside in, you get such a different impression of anything, right? So kind of understanding that part of the nature of complexity and learning it is ever widening understanding and ever widening scope and ever refining lens to what things are actually like and how they actually work. So that just means if you don't have enough knowledge, if you don't have enough experience, or you don't know enough, then just about every single one of your comments and insights and questions and are going to be sort of narrow in scope. And that's kind of another way of explaining why knockoffs and things, people aiming to create a kind of game experience that they see right in front of them, but slightly different, why they're just doomed to fail. If you think about the developers, even developers of old school games like Pokemon Red or whatever, they were trying to crystallize a design vision, right? When they first thought of Pokemon and Sugimura and all those people, what he has in mind, obviously it's been fleshed out over the years, and we can see now what the grand sort of vision for what Pokemon is and the universe that it is, but when it was just starting, it was nothing. So they did what they could with the technology that they could to express the ideas that were hopefully true to the vision, just maybe not the full vision, right? When they put Pokemon battling and catching in, it was two aspects of the Pokemon world that they could express very well through a video game, but there's so many more aspects. And that means every other decision they make in the game was made in light of that vision in light of that grander picture, that higher amount of complexity, and thus the choices and the decisions they make of what to cut, what to focus on, and what to do is reflective of that increased amount of complexity and understanding. You take somebody who played Pokemon, and oftentimes they just take everything as a matter of fact. Oh, of course the game had to be top down. Oh, of course you started in a small town. Of course you couldn't catch Pokemon at first. Of course they have to teach you how to throw Pokeballs. Of course there's gyms. Of course there's weakness resistance. Like all the stuff you just like absorb wholesale because that's how we enjoy art. That's how we enjoy the world. We just like let it hit us and then we absorb what we can over time. So there's nothing wrong with that. But the fact is, experiencing something like that and being a fan, there's no way you can get the full complexity of the thing itself, and there's absolutely no way you can see the full vision that the developers had when making that game. So you are doomed to make your own decisions when you're trying to create a knockoff that are going to be much less informed and much less reflective of the kind of real experiences and the kind of inspiration from real world things that inspired the original developers to create their original vision. Your vision is going to be freaking $30 piece of plastic that you put in your Game Boy and had fun playing in your car ride trips across the country when you were moving. Like that's your inspiration, playing a video game. It's very different. There's so much more to life, obviously, than playing video games, and the life that informs these video games is so much grander. So I think I say all this in a way of just kind of helping explain and helping you realize that the same kind of pros and cons and natures and drawbacks we see when dealing with complexities are evident in both many activities and things in real life and also in art and game creation especially. So that's kind of what I was getting at. So, when I think about the games I want to make, some of the kinds of feelings and experiences that I want to convey are from all my real world experiences. There's like nothing in a game that I would want to make a video game about. Right? Like I do a lot of meta stuff. I talk about how people talk about games. I talk about the structure of things that allow us to enjoy stories. I've broken down so many art forms, created a language, and to critique everything. Like there's no lack of meta analysis coming from me. However, my inspiration and what I really want to convey to people, it's much more simple, it's much more concrete, it's much more straightforward. And sure, if you read my short stories when I was working in college doing creative writing, you may not have gotten this impression. I guess it took a lot of years of trying to do art and trying to make things and trying to communicate and trying to sort of be able to even explain this to you now in so many words and have that thought crystallize as it is. So, I think I said it before. Whenever people... so we talked about it before in that Tim game. And one of the comments I made was like, look, they're just buildings floating out in space. Like, I don't like that kind of a thing. And the reason why I don't like that kind of a thing is because... I'm going to go ahead and start playing this video in the background. Might as well have something to move. The reason I don't like that kind of a thing is not because floating islands in space is a bad idea. Like, sure, do it. Like, any singular idea can be a good idea and can be executed well and fit into a bigger picture or be a small picture. Fine. What I'm saying is, the reason that they made the islands floating around in Tim is not probably because they're obsessed with sort of archipelagos. It's because they're not obsessed with like floating plant colonies and like and things like that from the real world, where they like grow plants in like floating water colonies and they kind of sustain it out from there. It's probably not because they are enamored by sci-fi space stations and how they can be a collection of individual floating structures that are connected by tubes or whatever. It's probably because they played a video game and that video game has something like that, right? Something where it was out of sort of a convenience or out of just sort of a simplification of representing a world, that they chose to represent their buildings and the pathways between these buildings as little nodes and little walkways. And being inspired by that, again, is like basing your decision making off of a much smaller, narrower picture and a much narrower idea. So when you riff off of that, you're not going to get more meaning. You're not going to get more genuine, interesting content. You're probably just going to get like, I don't know what you see, or just kind of like, oh, that's a neat idea. Not sure what it means. Not sure where it goes. It doesn't seem to build or connect to anything. The reason why it exists doesn't seem to be very apparent. And that's what my impression was of the floating islands in Tim Tim. I guess. Is there any way I can show you these floating islands? Let me see if I can pull it up. Tim overworld. Images. No, not easy to find a screenshot. But yeah, like, and you can, and then I said before in the yesterday's cast, like, well, maybe I can't tell what's a knockoff. Maybe I already do like some knockoffs and I don't even know they're knockoffs. Maybe I'm just making a big deal about this just because I don't like some things and I'm trying to make a reason why I think it's more significant than just me having an opinion. Maybe. But here's another interesting, food for thought, wrench to throw into this machine. There's something that's called Benford's Law. Yay! Smarty pants things in science and whatever. To sum up, is an observation about the frequency distribution of leading digits in many real-life sets of numerical data. Real life. I wonder why I was focusing on real-life things before, making a distinction between real-life things and made-up things. Anyway, the law states that in many natural occurring collections of numbers, naturally, the leading significant digit is likely to be small. For example, in sets that obey the law, the number 1 appears as the most significant digit about 30% of the time, while 9 appears as the most significant digit in less than 5%. If the digits were distributed uniformly, they would occur about 11% of the time. Benford's Law also makes predictions about the distributions of second digits, third digits, digit combinations, and so on. But essentially, if you didn't know, this is a thing. It's a real thing. And we were taught numbers in school, and then we were taught anything can be a number. Just shove some numbers together. That's a number. 3,756,823. I just made up a number, and everyone goes, "Wow, there's a number for every single possible amount of things." Like the world's filled with amounts of things and numbers. Therefore, the world must be filled with an even distribution of these numbers. Well, it turns out that is not true. And the more natural, real things you count, the more you see apparently this distribution hold up, right? So from an elementary perspective, you might think that the world is open to all these possible things happening of equally, or possible number combinations happening equally. But then after you've done enough observation, looked at enough things, and reflected enough on actual life, actual real world things, you'll see that this is more likely your distribution of the way the numbers pan out. And it's not even. And the world itself, and the complexity in the real world that we live in, has a trend or a bias or whatever you want to call it. This is just like an interesting example of thing you thought was simple in one way but the more you study it, it becomes another way. And the point I make is, if this is something that could be a true law for how numbers work, when we count things out there, count anything out in the real world, this is going to hold up, then that means whether you know it or not, there could be lots of laws, rules, trends, consistent elements about representing and reflecting real life that you are completely unaware of. But when you model things after real life, when you get inspired by real life, let's say that your game exhibits this curve quality naturally. You're like, oh, because I naturally see things in the real life and I want to represent that, my game naturally has these trends and qualities. And in that way, your game conveys a sense of authenticity, a sense of genuineness that's hard to put a finger on, but something that could be measured if you knew about the rule or if somebody took the time to measure your game. And this is also an interesting way to say, like, well, if you just made things up, it could ring false. It could ring false in a way that is sort of known to everybody on some level and consistent across so many different ways of looking at it. So I think one way that Benford's law was used was, I wanted to wrote about it here. There was a legal case where they caught a company fudging their numbers on, I guess, on the tax reporting or the reporting or whatever, and they looked at their numbers that they, now we know they made up over many, many years of bookkeeping, and their number distribution of significant digits was probably more evenly distributed because they made it up. And by putting this law and presenting this in court, they're like, this is what the real world is. There's no way they could have come up to these numbers over this many cases, over this many years. They made these numbers up. And then they proved them to be guilty. So, and I think just kind of taking a step back and thinking about it, there may be lots of ways to see a knockoff. And even if you can't sort of pin it down to an actual law or codified rule, you can be like, this doesn't sit well with me. Like, this doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't reflect the world. It just kind of reflects something that's either fake or incredibly unknown, subjective, or personal, and therefore it makes it hard to convey that experience in a relatable way. People, it just kind of it can have all kinds of negative effects. So that's sort of the high-level theory in a nutshell. It could not have nothing to do with me and my opinions. It could actually be things that are consistent and laws and true and recognizable about the real world. And if numbers can contain a secret law like that, then perhaps every complex system has something like that. Hard to say until you actually learn the system and study it. But we do know that making stuff up will be highly likely to not reflect any of those consistent truths or laws or whatever. So yeah, so there's a lot of different ways of thinking about complexity and inspiration and learning and modeling and so on and so forth. But to shift gears a little bit, this is a game called Claybook. Never played it. Looks neat. Always loved the aesthetic. What was I going to say about Claybook? Okay. So when I think about the kind of games that I want to make and I think about the world that I want to build and the interaction, whenever I see somebody talk about a fantasy world they want to make for an RPG, because everybody wants to make an RPG. Ooh, RPGs. When they instantly say, like, oh yeah, my world has goblins and elves and orcs and stuff, I just freaking roll my eyes every time. Like, come on. You're copying Lord of the Rings. And not only are you copying Lord of the Rings, but you're copying everybody else who copied Lord of the Rings. And everyone who copies it is doing a less and less good job of tapping into that sort of original vision, inspiration, and source, right? Everyone's doing just piggybacking off of things, and the results are noticeable. At least for me, that's why I roll my eyes in the first place. So whenever I think about the games that I'm trying to make, I don't draw off of, popular games like that. I don't say, like, when I make my own Zelda, it's really neat to sort of, as a thought experiment, think of what you would do with other people's IP, or what you would do with the game if you had, control over it. Cool. Think all you want. But as far as actually making games and actually realizing what's required to make sort of an original statement, a clear statement, a meaningful statement, then you kind of steer clear away from those sort of design pitfalls. So this is not just with world building and story. This is every single aspect of a game, right? From the way you do your camera, the way you do your physics-based interactions, the way you do your jumping, to go to the DO wheel. Where is it? Topic wheel. Yeah, every single one of these topics, right? You could do the way that you address your mechanics, the way you address your level elements or systems and rules, your power-ups, your economy, your enemy elements, your modes and features, your level design, feedback, the way you balance out your difficulty design and the skill spectrum, the way you do your story and handle your design space. You can have your own flavor and your own opinion and your own way of doing any of those things. You don't have to copy somebody else's template. You don't have to make Dragon Ball Z Fighters, which is like the same anime fighting game template, just with Dragon Ball Z characters on it and very, very few changes that are really Dragon Ball Z-like. You don't have to make another cookie cutter anime fighter. You don't have to make another cookie cutter shooter. Like, you don't have to do any of that if you, in my opinion, if you're a real designer, right? You would want to do things your own way. You would want to have your decisions reflective of your unique life. You would want to have enough clarity of who you are, what you want to say, and how to make it using the medium of your choice to be able to just walk the line from, I experience this, I feel this way, this is the part of that I want to take. According to the limitations of the medium, these are the things I have to watch out for, so this is the decision I'm going to make. You should be able to walk that line. And just as an example, one thing that has been bugging me a lot about the way a lot of games are built is I said that a lot of games are, and the models and the worlds that they build are hollow. And people are like, well, what do you mean that they're hollow? Well, like, well, everyone knows what I mean. If you get a camera too close to something and it clips into it, you see the inside of it and it's hollow. There's nothing there. The object that you thought was solid was actually just a floating texture on the outside of a polygonal rig, and the inside of it is not actually anything. It's just empty air. It's just a paper version of itself. It's a paper moon. That's what I mean by hollow. Now, of course, I know why video games do this. Technological limitations, a lot of it's clever ways of representing worlds and spaces. And in essence, everything you put into a video game has to be some kind of simplification or abstraction. Almost everything. So whether it's Mario jumping or the way that your character stands on the ground, that's just some clever math and some clever shortcuts to try to make things as efficient as possible but convey the idea as clearly as possible. And that's kind of what we mean by knowing what to abstract, right? Which details to put in, which details to put it more detail into, and which ones to cut out entirely to get the effect to happen to where nobody second guesses the fact that Mario's a dude jumping off the ground and running around. Nobody second guesses that. And even by extension, it's not even too weird that Mario exists in a world where there are floating elements hanging in the sky. Like, from that 2D perspective, which is the only perspective the game is presented in, that sort of exists interestingly on the fine line of the artifice of the presentation, right? Because it's 2D and you can't swivel the camera, you don't know what's behind there. And because you can't see it, and you don't know what's there, you kind of don't worry about it. And you kind of move on. You see the image as as the idea is trying to convey, instead of the sort of strange two-dimensional abstraction that it is. So when I think of my own games, and I'm like, okay, how do I stop games from being hollow, and why would I do that, right? My personal experience is playing sports, doing a lot of physical activity, exploring the forests and woods and snowy mountains and and doing dance and all kinds of things, right? There's a real sort of there's an aspect to doing things in real life that I like a lot, and the physicality and the momentum and the weight and the solidness of interacting with things in real life. How when you bump up against something, you can instantly tell that if it's heavier than you are, if it has things shaking around inside. Like, there's just so much to physically interacting with things that it's completely lost in games. We don't have sophisticated enough force feedback outside of like things like the Novant Falcon to really convey a sense of texture and force and resistance and springiness. So, outside of inventing a new technology that can do it, I'd rather design my games differently to try to convey those kinds of experiences and ideas a little bit more, just a little bit differently, a little bit more like the things I'm inspired by than games traditionally do. And I look at this game for an example. Like, this game, everything is solid. Look, he's cutting into this cake. Guess what's inside the cake? More cake. It's not hollow. That's actual, like, particles, atoms, however you want to think about it. It's like you're rolling over a solid mass, and every time you touch it, you rub a little bit on yourself and you leave divots. And right now he's running around absorbing chocolate items, so he's got to find the chocolate, like that little brown piece right here, and roll over it, almost like a Katamari. And he grows bigger, and he's got to get enough chocolate to win. There's a piece of chocolate right there. And there's that meta level where a boy's playing it on the side, kind of creepy. But this is just an interesting way to be like, oh, what an interesting technology, what an interesting look, what an interesting dynamic, consistent world. Touching things looks like it actually has a lot of force and physicality because you're putting in dense, real sort of accurate, dense divots and ripples, and that's really cool. Not to say that I would make my game out of clay or have everything be mushy, but thinking more about the idea of like, what does it mean to be a solid object in a video game? What kind of physics and physical interactions and forces can I convey using it rather than any other medium? And let me show a picture. Let's see.